Thank you very much, Mira. It's very exciting to be here. I just want to say, first of all, that Amy is right, that when we started, and she was just a freshman in college and interning with us, and she saw all sorts of possibilities. She not only recommended this for use in the classroom, for use with youth. My wife pushed very hard for use of the right question strategy in healthcare. We get a lot of push, and we do our best to actually respond. And so it may take us 20 years, Amy, but finally we got there. And I also want to thank the Harvard Graduate School of Education for hosting us. It's great to have, we have here faculty members who have been great supporters of our work at different points. Dick Murnane, Mara Kraszewski, Howard Gardner. Rick Weisbord, who's on the faculty here, is a former board member of the Right Question Institute. He sent an email from California saying he was sorry he couldn't be here. And our new best friend forever, where is she, Mira, who helped make this happen. So, thank you. Okay, so we are going to give you a quick little introduction, and then we're going to move you into an exercise. Luz will be leading you through a process that we use that is now being used by many educators and teachers in classrooms around the country and now around the world. Some of those educators are here today. If you check under your centerpiece and there's an envelope there, that means you're lucky enough to have one of those educators sitting at your table. But there are no centerpieces. Okay. Okay, but there are educators who have used the question formulation technique in the classroom, and they will be sharing with you some examples of how they've used it after you've gone through the process yourself. Okay. So, did Socrates get it right 2,500 years ago? So when he was strolling around the streets of Athens, troubling the youth of Athens, and asking a lot of questions, and basically making the point that you could learn a lot by thinking through questions, by asking a lot of questions, he was making a strong case for the value of asking questions. And that's something that we have continued to see. And I think that over 2,500 years, there's been a validation that questions are of great significance. And it can be significant just on a personal level. How many of you have ever been at a doctor's appointment and given information and you didn't even know what to ask at that point? Has that ever been an experience that you've had? So does that kind of capture that feeling? So how about if you realize 30 minutes after you've been at the doctor's appointment that you now figured out exactly what was the right question to ask? Okay? Now, if none of you have had this, maybe a very few of you have had this experience where you've been in a meeting and the first question comes up and you spend 2 hours discussing and deliberating that meeting, and 2 hours later you realize, you know what, that wasn't the right question. That was really the wrong question. We just wasted 2 hours. Does this capture what you feel like? Or how about if that first question instead of 2 hours, is referred to committee, and you spend 2 months on committee, and after 2 months you realize it's the wrong question. Does this capture the feeling? Actually, there's no picture that can capture that feeling. Okay. So what we have seen is that asking questions is really an extraordinarily powerful, renewable source of intellectual energy. You can keep on generating questions coming out of your mind. You are able to do it yourself. Now, some people may prefer an energy policy that has drill, baby, drill regarding the brain and try to drill things into you. But we've seen the value of people being able to produce their own intellectual energy, of being able to ask their own questions. So let's go 2,500 years from Socrates to Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1990, when Luz and Amy and I and others were working together. And we were participating in a dropout prevention program. And part of our work was actually working to engage parents in their children's education. And these were primarily low-income parents in the city of Lawrence. And they were telling us that they were not participating, they weren't even going to their children's school because they didn't even know what to ask. So we were very smart. It only took us 1,000 or 2,000 times of hearing that. And we realized, they really are onto something. So, of course, we did the wrong thing. we gave them a list of questions. And that only created more dependency. So we began to look at why is it that people reach adulthood and have named a problem of having difficulty asking their own questions. So let's just take a look at some basic skills. So this is a reading skill. So when you can see a kind of general upward slope, by the time that a student reaches the age of 18, 70% or so have basic reading skills. We're not going to talk about the 30% who don't. That's another problem, another lecture, and there are a lot of people here working on that. But just look at that slope. Okay, now look at this one. This is writing, and you have generally the same upward slope. So I'm going to introduce another skill to you. So it kind of peaks at around the age of 4. And then there's a sharp decline. And if you have any doubts about that, ask a parent of a 4-year-old or a teacher of an 18-year-old. There still are some people, some students, good number, asking questions, but there's a general downward slope. So what we found is that this is really a very common problem. The New York Times interviewed college presidents and asked them, what should a student know after 4 years of college? And Leon Botstein of Bard said, a student should know how to frame a question. Nancy Cantor, now the president of Syracuse, said that the best we can do for students is to have them ask the right questions. So that is, in a sense, naming the problem that they're entering college not able to do that. So when you think about the 2,500 years since Socrates and the amount of knowledge that has been generated and accumulated in the world, and you think about that one same skill that Socrates was talking about, and you look at, you could kind of stack up the knowledge of the last 2,500 years and of the last 25 years, and you compare it to how well have we developed this skill of question asking, the gap is enormous. It's a simple skill. What's the problem? We need to deliberately teach the skill of question formulation. People who may have access to an elite education, sitting around the Harkness table at Exeter, having opportunities to gain a lot of professional experience. How do we learn to ask good questions? Very often it's through negative experiences or from finding out mistakes that we made, so we count on a lot of time to do that. But how could we learn how to do that on our own? There's a need to deliberately teach the skill of question formulation. That was something that we learned from the parents in Lawrence in 1990. They named the problem very clearly in a way that many other people had never even noticed. Now, what happens when you actually teach people to ask their own questions? Well, at one point, Luce and I and and a colleague of ours, we went to Hawaii. We were asked by the Department of Health in the state of Hawaii to come and work with sugarcane plantation workers who were about to lose their livelihood, their sole source of livelihood, about to lose their company-owned housing, company-provided health care, and they didn't know what was going to happen. So we kind of wondered, what are we doing kind of traveling all the way there with our toolbox was very limited. It basically had a piece here on question asking and another piece on decision making, which we'll share with you a little bit later. And we got there and got off the plane, and I kind of wondered, well, can we go back? Because I'm not sure that we have a lot here to offer. Well, it was really interesting. After the training, the participants in the training talked about now they were able to focus on the decisions that they could still have a say in. They didn't have a say in the corporate decision to shut the plantation down, but they could ask about how the land was going to be used. They could ask about what kinds of job training opportunities were going to be offered instead of just pushing them into hotel services industry. They could ask about how healthcare was going to be provided. There were lots of opportunities for them to play a role, and that was what they discovered. Now, that same strategy was taken to along the Mexico-New Mexico border. There was a shooting in a school, and parents in the community, Mexican immigrant parents, had never set foot had never crossed the threshold of their children's school. And the parents saw the problem, and 4 of them got together And they used the question formulation process to look at how can they think about the issue. They were working with somebody who we had trained, and who Luce and I were sure this person had slept through most of the training, but apparently he didn't. He took it back, he shared it with them, and the next week they had 100 parents. They brought them there, they went through the same process with them, and what they found was that they were able to begin to participate, ask questions about what kinds of violence prevention programs could be offered in the school, what kind of resources were available, what kind of resources, how they could provide transportation, a whole range of examples of what they could do. And we've seen this pattern continue. We worked with the medical school of City College of New York, and there we had worked with fourth-year medical students who were trained to go into community health center waiting rooms in the Bronx and Bedford-Stuyvesant and basically teach the essence of our strategy in 10 minutes. So we didn't know whether to kind of be thrilled by that or be offended by it. But it was, it was really great because basically what they showed that what we had started out with 20 years ago, which was a 32-hour parent involvement curriculum, that there had been a way of figuring out how do you boil this down so you could teach it quickly and people could use it. And the patients there said things like, I didn't know decisions were made here. This is in the health center. I didn't know I could ask questions here. I didn't know they'd want to hear my questions. That's another question. I didn't know what to ask about. So over and over again, we saw that. Now, that's our work. That's a lot of the work of the Right Question Institute. It turns out that a lot of people have come along and have discovered the universal value of what we've developed. So a couple weeks ago, somebody who's been donating pro bono advising services to the Right Question Institute asked me to come to his venture capital groups of CEOs and startup CEOs to help them lead them through the question formulation process and how they could use it in their business. We've taught the same process to Harvard Law School students. In one large class, more than 50% of them said that it was in the top 25% of their experiences at Harvard Law School. Now, Martha Minow is on our national board, and I'm sure it's no reflection on the teaching at Harvard Law School. But what it shows is that the universal value of this carries across different communities, class levels of education. So what we've been really working on in our work is basically this question. What is the maximum that can be achieved by teaching the minimum? We're not asking what's the maximum that, we're not asking what is the minimum that can be achieved by teaching the most you can. I think we see evidence of a lot of that. We're trying to look at what are the possibilities? How much can people learn when they're given the most minimal starting point for being able to do this? And what the parents named 20 years ago, it turns out it's relevant not only to them, it's relevant to Harvard Law School students, it's relevant to CEOs, it's relevant to Mexican immigrant parents learning to advocate for themselves. So what we have been working on is how do you teach this? And over this past couple of years, thanks to Harvard Education Press asking us to write about this for teachers, we have been thrilled to see examples of great teaching in the classroom of teachers quickly taking this and integrating it into their work, and it's been very exciting. So that's basically the preamble to the experience that you're going to have now. We're going to take you through about a quick 30-minute experience in which you're going to get to go through the entire question formulation technique that is pretty much the same process that has been used in all the examples that I've talked about. Okay? Thank you. So I have one request. We have a table here of two teachers who are coming from as far away as they could possibly come on the other side. So I'm going to actually ask one of you to join another table so you can be part of another group, because we promise to distribute the wealth of the teachers who have been practiced here.
And the people in the back, Dan.
Okay. And people at the back, if you wanted to try to come and join a table, that would be great.
I'm going to use this. Is that easier, you think?
It's pretty easy.
Okay, so it is work time. And I'm going to lead you through the question formulation technique process. And right now you might be asking, what are we asking questions about? So don't worry about that. I will be giving you in a minute what we call a question focus. And a question focus is the topic in statement format. We will use it to come up with our own questions. Okay, so let me tell you a little about how the process will work. So each table, it is a small group. At the table, you have newsprint and markers. So I would like you to write down your questions in the newsprint. So the first thing for the small group to do is to find a recorder, a volunteer to write the questions. So who would like to do that? Okay, find a volunteer in your group who will write down the questions. Do you all have a volunteer already? Volunteers? Okay, so let's move with it. So in order to produce questions, there are some rules that we will be following. And there are 4 rules. The first one is ask as many questions as you can. Do not stop to answer, Josh, or discuss the questions. Write down each and every question exactly as it is stated, and change any statements into questions. So those are the rules. Just make sure that you follow them. Now, before I give you the question focus, what do you think will be difficult about following these rules? What do you think might be difficult about following the rules? Yes? Trying to answer them? Thank you. What else might be difficult about following these rules? Yes? You always want to judge? Thank you. What might be difficult? Yes? Okay, writing fast enough. Thank you. Mara?
Listening and writing down exactly what you hear.
Okay. Thank you so much. So remember, these are the rules that we will be following throughout the exercise. Now, let's get to the question focus. Citizens are not asking questions about decisions that affect them. So this is what you will be asking questions about. So for the next 3 minutes, what I would like you to do is to ask as many questions as you can. Do not stop to try to answer, judge, analyze the questions. Write down each and every question exactly as it is stated, so you have to watch the scribe, and then turn any statements into questions. As you produce the questions, could you please also number the questions? Okay, so time, 3 minutes. Ask questions about this topic. Go. And citizens are all residents of a community. Has nothing to do with legal status. Remind me to ask for permission to record the reports. The recording, okay. But not on camera. Okay. So how are we doing? Remember that all kinds of questions.
Okay, just asking questions, no discussion, we're just going to wrap this up.
About 1 more minute. Okay, finish writing down that last question. Finish writing down that last question. And let me know when you are ready. Okay, so very quickly, let's switch color of markers between tables. I will get you one. Okay, did we all switch? Okay, so let's move on. So let's look at the questions that you have produced. And in your list, you probably have two types of questions. Close-ended questions, and those are the questions that can be answered with a yes or a no, or with one word. In your list, you also have open-ended questions, and those are the questions that need an explanation, and they cannot be answered with a yes or a no. Very quickly, 1 minute, go over your list and mark all those questions that can be answered with yes or no or with one word. Go. Do we have them all? Okay. Time is up. Time is up. Okay, let's think about these two types of questions that you have in your list. And maybe there is one or two groups that just have open-ended questions. That's okay, we will work with it. let's think about the two types of questions. And first, the close-ended questions. What will be some advantages of asking those questions that can be answered with yes, no, or with one word? Advantages. Yes. You get a decisive answer. Thank you. They may open up a new set of questions. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, quick. Thank you. All right. Yes. Thank you. So, and what will be some disadvantages of asking the close-ended questions? Disadvantages. Dead end. Thank you. Yes.
Limited information.
Thank you. Any other disadvantages that you can think of? Yes. Thank you. I have somebody here in the back. Okay, thank you. Yes. Thank you. All right, so let's now.
Sometimes a first answer question is a statement disguised as a question.
Okay, so
Sometimes you ask a question,
thank you. All right, so let's look now at the open-ended questions. What will be some advantages of asking those questions that need an explanation? Yes. You get people to think beyond the question. Thank you. Yes. There might be unlimited answers. Thank you. Advantages of the open-ended? What you know will help you. Yes?
It involves them more.
Thank you. So now let's look at some disadvantages of asking the open-ended. Disadvantages. Yes? Endless discussion. Thank you. Disadvantages of the open-ended? Yes?
You off track from what the main.
Thank you. Can you repeat it, please?
Take you off track of the main subject.
Take you off track, the main subject. And sometimes people will give you the runaround, right? And will never answer the question. Okay, so there are advantages of asking the close-ended questions as well as disadvantages, advantages of asking the open-ended, and disadvantages. So what people need to figure out is when it's better for them to ask a close-ended question and when an open-ended question will work best. All right, so let's take this to another step. I would like you to take one of your close-ended questions and change it into an open-ended one. Now, if you don't have a close-ended question, come up with one now. So for reports, I'm going to ask for 3 groups and then for people to add.
I'm going to do a little something with the divergence. So I'll step on that.
Okay.
I don't get to the next one.
Do we have one question that we change? Do we all have one question that we change from closed to open. Is that a yes that I'm hearing? Okay. So now, so let's move on. Take one of your open-ended questions and close it down. Half a minute to do that. Do we have it? Let's take this to a last step. Let's move on and let's take this process to a last step. What I would like you to do now is to look at your list of questions and take the 3 most important questions, meaning to prioritize. While you prioritize, keep in mind your question focus. Choose the 3 most important. 2 minutes to do that. For these reports, I'm not going to ask everybody to share. We move there. Do we have 3 priority questions? Do we? Do we have 3 priority questions, all tables? No? Half more minute? Okay, time is up. Time is up. Time is up. Now let's hear from the groups, and I'm looking for 3 groups to volunteer their questions. Hello, hi. Time is up.
Report back now. We're going to do a reporting back now.
Thank you. All that excitement working with the priority questions, I can't believe it. So, all right, so I'm asking for 3 groups to volunteer to share their questions. And this is the way that we are going to do it. I would like you to share the question that you changed from closed to open, and then the question that you changed from open to close. Read the original question and then the new question. Follow that with sharing your 3 priority questions. And then, why did you choose those 3 as the most important? And those are the instructions for now. So which groups are volunteering? You are, right? Who else? Thank you. I need another group. Thank you. All right, so the rest of the group also has work. One of, said it, Dan. Go ahead, go ahead. Go ahead.
Since we don't have enough time for all groups, we do want you to think about if you hear questions that are similar, the natural inclination sometimes to go back to your small group and say, oh yeah, we had that question. But you miss their next priority question, which might be one that you didn't have. So we're going to ask you to just listen to the questions that they present and see if there are questions that they have that are different from yours. And if you have something very different from that that you want to add to it after that, then we can take examples.
Thank you, Dan. All right, so can you share? Can I borrow your microphone, please?
Okay, so our open-ended question, that we changed was, why are citizens not asking questions about decisions that are affecting them? And we changed it to, are citizens not asking questions about decisions that are affecting them? And then our closed-ended question was, are we citizens? And we changed it to, what makes us citizens? And then our 3 priority questions was, why are citizens not asking questions about decisions that are affecting them? What is affecting citizens? And what decisions are they making? We chose these 3 priority questions because, like someone said earlier, that one of the advantages is that it opens up new topics. And all these 3 questions opening up, it branches out to other topics that can help answer the question.
Thank you. And can you share the numbers of your priority questions?
Which ones were the most?
The numbers. 1.
Oh, sorry.
1, 3, and 7.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we give them a hand, please?
Oh, the microphone.
Thank you. Okay, the group in the back.
Questions from our group. The open question was, what counts as citizen? And we made it close-ended. Am I a citizen? And the close-ended question we had, do they know about the decision? The open-ended question is, how do different citizens understand these decisions? The 3 questions we picked are, what decisions affect the citizens? The second one is, are they aware that there are decisions? And the third question is, who is making the decision? There are 2 open-ended, 1 close-ended question. So we picked these questions because these are the core, and we pick the open questions as higher priority. And once we have those answers, then the close-ended questions will really nail down to the point. So that's why that was the last questions we have.
Thank you. And what were the numbers of your priority questions?
4, 11, 16.
Thank you. And this group?
Can't hold it. Our 3 open-ended, thank you. Our 3 open-ended questions were numbers 1, 5, and 16, which sounds familiar. They were, why not? Which decisions are being referred to? And do they and I have the same idea of what affects them? So those were our 3 open-ended questions. And I'm not sure I can give you a rationale. We just went to them, and everybody nodded that they were the right ones. So it was instinctive and not anything apparently rational. We had changed number 10, which was, do they feel unqualified to ask, which was a closed question, to the open question, why do they feel unqualified to ask? And we changed one more. We went from which decisions are being referred to. No. Sorry, we went to this one. What is a citizen, which was an open question, to do you agree with this dictionary definition of citizen, which became a closed question.
Thank you. And can the group help with the rationale for choosing?
I think we did because we thought we had a question that was about the decisions themselves, the effect, and the people. So we were trying to get at different parts of the Q focus or whatever.
Thank you. Can we give them a hand?
So were there examples from other groups that you wanted to share?
Our first priority question was, what are the consequences of not asking questions?
Thank you. Others?
One of ours was, what situation would encourage citizens to ask questions?
Thank you.
When and why do people lose the ability to ask questions?
Thank you.
And just quickly, in terms of the numbers, the sequencing of the priority questions, where were they in the sequencing of the numbers? The priority questions? 4 and 7. Uh-huh. 8, 14, 15. 1, 9, and 10.
And this group?
Okay, all right, we'll move on.
Okay, so you went through the process. That's it. You produce your own questions, you improve your questions, and you prioritize your questions. Those were the 3 basic steps that we cover. Now, let's think about the work that you did and what did you learn? What did you learn?
I learned it's harder to take a closed-ended question and make it open than I learned the opposite, that it's hard to take an open-ended question and close it.
Thank you.
Flexibility. That even the question has flexibility, that you're not stuck in one mode.
Thank you. Other lessons?
2, 4, 6, 9 heads are better than 1 in raising all the questions that need to be asked.
Thank you. What else did you learn?
It became pretty clear that some questions contained a whole lot of other questions in them. And by going to that question, we would open up the possibility of exploring 6 or 7 other things that were on there. And that was an important insight.
Thank you. Be back with some.
I learned something about the other people at my table. I learned about their obsession over spelling and over also the kinds of things that they cared about, speakers, if their passion for spelling. So I actually learned a fair amount about who I was sitting with.
Thank you.
I think actually it was hard for us to decide to agree on our priority questions because as soon as it came down to limiting, we had to really think of a strategy and what was important to us.
Thank you.
I think that the types of questions will ultimately determine your understanding.
Thank you.
I'm going to take two more, and then we'll move on.
I learned that I'm curious about why or what you learned from asking the numbers of the questions.
Thank you. And we have one more in the back.
I learned that as we ask questions, there was a good one near the beginning, a good one near the middle, and a good one near the end. So don't stop at the first one.
Thank you. And how did you learn what you learned? How did you learn it?
I think that we learned by suspending judgment and realizing that there weren't any stupid questions.
Thank you.
By doing it. I never thought it would be so hard to do one of these steps until I tried to do it.
Thank you. And we have somebody there too.
I was going to say that by observing as questions developed, that's what I learned.
Thank you.
I heard a lot of different language being focused on. So our group didn't focus so much on the word citizen, but other groups did. And I learned a lot by noticing that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
So when we look, should I take the microphone back? Sorry. So you just went through a process that is pretty much the same process that similar to what the sugarcane plantation workers went through, Mexican immigrant parents, patients in the community health center, Harvard Law School students, high-tech CEOs, same process. And a lot of the things that they name about what they learned is very similar to what you named. About learning, looking at it from different angles, going through the process, discovering that how you ask the question determines the kind of information you get, that you can go deeper, that you winds up what seems like a detour, spending time on questions actually becomes a shortcut, that there's lots of things that can happen that way. So we tried to really understand why does this happen, and the opportunity we had to write the book gave us some time to spend thinking about it, because most of our work requires a lot of work and not enough time for thinking. And so the writing of the book gave us a chance to do that. And when we spend time observing in the classrooms of many of the great teachers who are here in this room, we saw three different kinds of thinking abilities being used in this one process. So we saw divergent thinking going on, which is by the use of the rules for producing questions. And when we come up with the 4 rules for producing questions, it took us about 7 years to come up with 4 rules. Now, I don't want you to think that we're sitting in a room spending 7 years trying to come up with 4 rules. We spent 7 years learning in the field what was the minimum that had to be used in order to help people who are not accustomed to asking questions to be able to start asking questions. So it was by working with people who are not accustomed to participating, not accustomed to asking questions, what could we learn from them about what would be the minimum required to allow them to begin to ask questions. And this is really, I think, in some ways the real heart of the work of the Right Question Institute, is trying to look at what has been overlooked or skipped over by a lot of solutions of what people should be doing or advocating for people or telling people what to do. But it's really about how do you build a process that allows people to do the thinking for themselves. So the 4 rules basically provide a rigorous structure for allowing people to do divergent thinking. And in some ways, we could just stop at the first rule. You remember the first rule? Just ask as many questions as you can? I mean, we could reduce it to one rule. But the reason that we have the other rules about do not stop to judge, discuss, answer, about change statements into questions, about write it down exactly as it's stated, is because what we've observed is how difficult it is, how difficult the task is to just request from people ask questions. And I think many of you as teachers know that. You can ask, are there any questions? And you see a kind of room full of blank stares. I was talking with a physics graduate student here at Harvard a couple weeks ago who teaches a section here as part of a course. He said, trying to get questions out of my students is like pulling teeth. So the problem exists universally. So these 4 rules provide a structure and a process for doing divergent thinking. So then, after you've done that divergent thinking, it's not enough to stop at divergent thinking, which is in some ways interesting because it's similar to a critique of brainstorming that was written about in the New Yorker a few weeks ago. And so the problem of doing just divergent thinking is you're not necessarily left in a better place. So you go to a next step and you do convergent thinking. So when you're looking at open and closed-ended questions, you're changing them, you're thinking about the different uses of questions, and then you prioritize. And you have to start thinking about, well, why is this question more important than the other one? How could I use this one? How will this question help me more than this other one? And then you discover along the way that, well, you might have started with one question that you still really want to know the answer to, but there was another one that you didn't discover until you got to the end. So that convergent thinking allowed you to go further and deeper into it. And again, it was just by using the process. Now, there's the third thinking ability, and it's metacognition, metacognitive thinking. Because at different points in this process, and I think that we have to emphasize that in the work that we do, if in the situations that we've been in around the country and places where we've worked, is asking people to think about their thinking is an entirely new experience. And the power of this process winds up being fully experienced when people see that they went through a thinking process and they can actually name how they learned. So at different points we asked you what might be difficult about following these rules. So we wanted you to be thinking about how do these rules challenge maybe traditional ways of your thinking. Then we asked you to think about advantages and disadvantages of open and closed-ended questions to see that there might be different uses for the different kinds of questions. Then we asked you not only to prioritize, but to explain why you prioritized, to think about why you chose those ones. And then finally, we concluded by asking you to talk about just what you had learned, and then to think about how you had learned it. So basically, you went through 3 steps: divergent thinking, convergent thinking, and then you went into metacognition thinking about it. Now, that, in a sense, that's the whole question formulation technique. And that is really what is in the book. Now, what we're going to do is spend a couple of minutes here sharing with you just an overview of the other piece of the work that we do, which is on decisions, which is how do you build the same capacity of people not only to ask questions, but to participate much more effectively in decisions that affect them, which is looking at that question focus that you worked on. So think about the questions that you asked, and now look at what we have developed as a way to build people's capacity to participate in decisions. Oh, I skipped one here. Socrates. I don't want to forget Socrates, okay? We started off with Socrates. Did Socrates get it right? And now we're asking, did Socrates get it wrong? Well, sometimes the problem with the Socratic method can be about the wise person at the front of the room leading the less wise in the rest of the room through a process. It's not personal. It's not about you. It's about me. I mean, it's not, but it's just about how do you turn that over? How do you turn that thinking ability over to more people? And that really is the lessons from the parents in Lawrence, that they were most effective when they asked questions about decisions. And so they led us into another whole new level of discovery.
So, and in order to be able to ask questions about decisions, the first step is to know what a decision is. If you don't know the definition of a decision, it is likely that decisions will be made and you will not be able to identify the decision. 3 things about the parents in Lawrence was that they were most effective when they are asked questions about the reasons for making the decision, and also in reason why the decision was made, what was the basis for making the decision, and also questions about the process for making the decision, when, where the decision was made, who was involved in making the decision, and then also questions about the role that they could play in the decision-making process. In these 3 types of categories of questions, it was also interesting that people were able to very easily ask questions about the reasons for the decision. A little more difficult to ask questions about the process for making the decision, and then lots of difficulties in asking questions about their role, the role that they can play in making the decision, in influencing the decision, in changing the decision. So we saw through the work that not knowing how to ask questions about these 3 points was leaving lots of people out of participating in the decision-making process. We also learned that if people were able to ask questions about these 3 points, all the encounters that they were having with programs, services, and institutions were more effective for them, and they were able to get very often the services that they needed. One example of how parents could participate effectively was offered by the individual education plans at the schools, the IEPs, because the individual education plans ask participation to make decisions about the services being provided, how the services are being provided, and they invite the parents to participate. But if they don't know how to, it is impossible to do. So therefore, there is a need to build a skill, the skill of question formulation, but not only about asking questions that are focused on these 3 points. There is a connection between these 3 points and democracy.
So basically what we were able to pull out of this is that as we learned, we realized that when people are asking questions about the reasons, they're asking it with an expectation that there are going to be legitimate reasons. It's not discriminatory ones, not arbitrary ones, ones that are based on policies, standards, rules. The second is that when they're asking questions about the process, there's an expectation of transparency, that I have a right to know about how this decision was made, what information was used, what information was not used. And then when they're asking questions about their role, they're really talking about opportunities for participation. And these are 3 criteria that are essential criteria for accountable decision-making in a democracy. Remove one of them, and you have a problem. You can have an opportunity, you can know the reason, and you can know everything about the process for it, but if you can't play a role in it, you're pretty limited. Or if you're actually told you can play a role, but you have no idea what the process is, you're also pretty limited. So this is the way, basically what we have figured out is that there's really a core piece here that is about that's essential to democratic participation. Reason, legitimacy, process, transparency, and role, opportunities for participation. And we developed a concept that we call microdemocracy. And in our work, what we have seen, particularly in low-income communities, people have lots of encounters with public institutions. The welfare office, Medicaid-funded social service, public housing, healthcare, social services, public housing. And there are, in fact, well over 100 million encounters a year at what we call outposts of democracy. All of those publicly funded services are related to decisions made further up in the democratic decision-making chain. But if people are not participating at that micro level, why would we expect people to be participating on any other level? If they're not seeing the decisions that are being made there that affect them, and they're not practicing the skills of participation at that level, then they also are not going to be participating and practicing on other levels. And we look forward to your book, Meera, about students and their experiences in schools and whether that supports, reinforces, or suppresses participation and their sense of themselves as citizens. So this is, in a sense, this is the argument that we've made, that individuals using essential self-advocacy and democratic skills to participate effectively in their ordinary encounters with public institutions. What had been an endpoint of participation, of interaction with the public arena, can instead become a new beginning point for democratic action, but it requires having the skills, the ability to ask questions and focus effectively on decisions. So if you think back to our question about what is the maximum that can be achieved by teaching the minimum, this is pretty much, this is the beginning point. When people are able to ask questions and participate decisions in ways that they've not done before, it opens up new avenues that hadn't existed before. So now we're going to move it over to Amy, and we're going to hear from Amy and from teachers. We have great teachers here, and then we're going to be taking questions at the end of the session from everybody.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a high school teacher. I teach about an hour north in a high school called Haverhill High School. I'll tell you a little bit about my school. Haverhill is a medium-sized city. It's on the Merrimack River. It's about 20 minutes north of Lawrence. It was a mill town that made shoes. It's called Slipper City or Shoe Town. Our high school is, I would say, struggling. We have a poverty rate of 42% among our 1,700 students. We have a dropout rate on paper of 8 to 9%. But in reality, just to give you one statistic, 100 out of the incoming freshman class, out of 500 students, 100 will repeat their freshman year. So the freshman year retention rate is about 20%. We have about 46% that go to college for 4 years, or start college for 4 years, 28% that go to a 2-year college. So on paper, we say that 75% of our kids go on to higher education. Whether they complete, I don't know. We have a problem with lack of participation of parents. To give you an idea, I teach over 100 students. I had 5 parents at the last parent-teacher conference, none from my lowest level classes. So I work in not the worst school in the world, but one that definitely struggles. I used the question formulation technique with my students last week. Our question focus was the decision to drop the atomic bomb. We are in the middle of our World War II unit, and we haven't studied that yet. And so I did this in anticipation of having them write a persuasive essay where they had to evaluate Truman's decision. So the only thing I told them is that the topic was the decision to drop the atomic bomb and that we would be discussing it next week, and this was in preparation for our discussion. I had 2 classes I did this with. One was a college prep junior class. The other was an honors junior class. And on the whole, they really loved writing on big pieces of paper with colorful markers. That was so much fun for them. And I think for some of the kids, it was really eye-opening to be asked by the teacher to come up with the questions rather than to be asked the questions for a change. And for some of them, it created a lot of anxiety. I had some students who actually said, well, why are we doing this? You know, you're the one who's supposed to ask the questions. Are you getting lazy, miss? Making me do all the work now? And there is some truth to that. It did make them work harder. And some felt that it was hard to give the authority, or for me to give them the authority to actually think for themselves, and they kind of resisted it. They didn't want to do it. They kept checking with me. Is this right? Are we doing this right? And I kept throwing it back at them, you know, keep working at it, follow the rules. My honors class took to it like a fish to water. They loved the idea that someone finally wanted to know what they thought about, what they wanted to know about. And they easily grasped the idea of open and close-ended questions. And at the end of the experience, some of them actually said, well, this was too easy. Make it harder. They wanted more. They were still hungry. So I would challenge and ask Dan, how do you make it more challenging for people that are ready to go further? For my first class, which was more of a college prep class, they had kids of varying abilities. There were a handful of kids that still did not understand what closed-ended and open-ended meant and how to go between the two. And so another challenge in doing this work would be for the kids that are still behind intellectually. They just don't grasp the concept and they don't know how to manipulate their thinking in a way. So what do we do for kids that are challenged by being asked to think in this new way? Are there ways to kind of even make this simple process even simpler? And then my last observation before I open this up is I was thinking about my colleagues. My colleagues are quite different than I am, most of them. One colleague complimented me by saying I was the best middle school teacher the high school had. And he said that it's just unfortunate that I'll never get to the World Trade Center bombings in time for June. And so we had a little debate, and we talked about how if we were bus drivers and we were driving the bus and we were trying to go over a bridge, that he would make it across the bridge, but my bus would break down halfway across the bridge because I wouldn't get all the way across the curriculum. And I went back and I said, well, at least my bus has all the students on it. Your bus only has 10 students on it because they've all jumped out the window. So the question, the third challenge, I guess, is what do you do for teachers that are either reluctant to give up their authority to students? And what do you do for the teachers who say, we teach in the age of MCAS accountability, this stuff, as wonderful as it is and how great it is to write on big chart paper with markers and hang things up with, you know, Post-it note paper and stuff, as wonderful as this is, we don't have time for this fuzzy stuff. We got to pass the MCAS. We've got to get our accreditation. We've got to move on. And if I did this for every unit, I would never get the bus across the bridge. So how do you do this and get the bus across the bridge? So those are my comments. I do want to say in closing, before I take questions, that the high school is an outpost of democracy. Teaching kids to think and question is not just good teaching and learning, it's a social justice issue. I strongly believe that. Questioning is important. And as a high school teacher, I really do believe that it's not just our job to get the bus across the bridge, but to have the bus full of kids who are ready to take over and drive the bus themselves someday. So with that being said, I'd like to hear from some of the other folks who've tried this in their classroom and what your experiences have been.
Actually, can we just have the teachers who have been in the book? We invited teachers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you don't mind.
Do they want to come on down?
We're actually, if the teachers who maybe could come up, who have been used it, who wants to go first? Want to do this quickly? Okay.
So I thought I was prepared, but after listening to Amy, I'm not really prepared, but I'll share anyway. My name is Yana, and I've done this work. This is my third year doing this in the classroom. I teach at Urban Science Academy. There is my partner, Lindsay Pete. So she's going to share her experience. I work with freshmen this year, the first year. I used to work at Boston Day and Evening Academy, and that was a program for overage students who are getting another chance to get a high school diploma. So I want to actually ask you a quick question. Can you, if you're educators, can you please raise your hands? I just want to see the audience. Okay, thank you very much. So I can actually see that this time around, there are not only teachers in the audience. So I want to backtrack quickly and tell you why I decided to do it. Dan and Luz came to our school about 2.5 years ago, and they extended it to teachers to do this. And they said, whoever's interested, this is something that these wonderful people are going to be doing, and I've never heard about this before. But I connected with my previous experience. So one of our essential questions from our group was, in what way does gender and or culture affect these people asking questions? So I was born in the Soviet Union, and if you are buffers of history, you know that a totalitarian style of teaching, you're sitting in the classroom, your hands are literally together, your hands are together like this, you raise your hand, you get up, and then you are reporting to your teacher. So when I immigrated to the United States, I actually realized that asking questions or speaking for yourself or advocating is exactly the work that these people have done. You actually can learn, need to learn. Sometimes you're not born with it. You do have to know how to talk to your college people. And you actually, if you bring your paper the next day, it's an F. Even though in Russia it's not, but here it is. And it took me a whole freshman year in my college to actually adapt to the culture because my skills were completely different from the skills that are expected to be embedded here. So this is like an important connection to me because when I come into my classrooms, I see students from Somali, I see students from Puerto Rico, from Dominican Republic, from Vietnam, from other countries. I'm not thinking about Jamaica. And I see that they're full of experiences, but the vehicles from those experiences for connections are sometimes not there. So we're using this protocol not only to kind of teach them the content, and I want to connect with Amy because I totally agree with her idea of social justice, but it's also to give them the critical thinking, the base that you become an advocate for yourself, for your learning, for your education. So it's a repeated skill. You have to repeat it all the time because your muscle, just like with anything else, it needs repetition. So going back to the classroom, the recent unit we just finished, we read a novel, The Absolute Diary of a Part-Time Indian, written by Sherman Alexie. It's a Native American writer from Spokane Reservation. His main character is a freshman, and he's going between his own culture and the strive for success and breaking away from the cultural expectations. So we have applied this particular protocol, and we actually didn't have only one prompt. We broke a group, and that's suggested per my colleague, into 6 different prompts. And we asked the students to self-select themselves into the prompts, which we call a question focus. For example, we also used it's encouraged to have a provocative statement or a picture or maybe a musical piece. This time we were very primitive and we used one word. We used the word identity, education, environment, violence, alcoholism. But before that, we pre-taught themes, and we talked about themes and we had discussions, so it was not in the beginning of the unit, it was in the middle. And the students, according to their interests, developed questions. So we then use these questions for our do now. For those of you who are not in the classroom, it's the first task you do when you come into the classroom. It's going to get ready to settle in. It's a quick assignment. We use it for our quizzes, for essays, for journal entries, for homework. We compiled maybe about 200 different questions. And there was a pool of different questions. We selected the essential questions from each group. For bigger assignments and smaller questions, the students did not select those, but they were on the list. We post them in the classrooms. It's very visual. It's very empowering when you come in and your whole wall is covered with different questions. So you can see the multitude of different usage, but my bottom line is there is a voice in each student with those questions. So that's, I wanted to add that. Thank you.
I worked with Yana for a while at Boston Day and Evening Academy, which is Boston Public School. And so I was thinking about what life was like before Right Question process, because I've been using it now for 2 or 3 years. And so that was kind of what started my thinking. I've always used questions. As teachers, I think we do ask students to ask questions, but my experience before having this process was that students would get stuck and frustrated. I'd have them coming up with their research questions or questions for the experiment they were going to do. And I would leave this table, and then I'd come back and they had one more question, and that's it. And they didn't want to do any more, and they were frustrated and they were stuck. And they worked individually to come up with these questions, and I would just keep checking in, and then these questions would just get housed in their notebooks or their binders. And it was just another task for them to complete. Those were that's how I felt things were before this process. Once I had this process, it became, as you saw today, collaborative, group work, engaging. It was a flow of ideas, empowering, we've heard that word already, and very public, like Yana was talking about, and as well, you were with the chart paper they love using. So I brought in some examples of one of my classes now, and the other thing I was thinking about is that I use this process beginning, middle, end for a variety of reasons. At the beginning of a class, I tend to use it for a couple reasons. One, to get their prior knowledge on a topic, to start a unit, engage them, but also to teach the process. So I tend to try and do the Right Question process within the first week so that we're really learning this and I can use it later without having to explain everything the first time. So the first time it takes longer, and then the next times it can go quicker. So my example, so I'm just going to tell you about my anatomy and physiology class and 3 ways that I've used it. So we were learning about the brain and the nervous system. And we dissected brains, because I really love experiential learning. So we started by just dissecting brains and not talking about what they're seeing, just exploring the brains. And then I had the question focus, which was human brains are the same as sheep brains. And in hindsight, that was not the right question focus, because they had a lot of questions about sheep. And I really wanted to talk about the human body. So in the future, next trimester, I might just say brains. Or I just might put the brain back on the table and say, ask questions. I think that would get them more focused where I wanted. And then those questions I used to guide my lessons. So I already kind of knew what I was going to talk about, but I was able to say, here was your question from last week. We're going to address this today in our lesson. Here was your other question. Now I'm going to tell you why sheep can't talk. And then another way I really enjoy using questions is to have the students get excited about field trips or speakers that are coming in. So we had a scientist visiting our anatomy and physiology class. And so I plopped the word up, scientist. And they each had to brainstorm questions about scientists. And I didn't tell them anything about the person coming in, just the word scientist. And they came up with some great questions. They could not number it down to 3 priorities, so we got some double stars on things here. But how long does it take to become one? Do you ask a lot of questions? What does your day look like? What do you do on the weekends? Do you study the same things as doctors? So lots of great questions that I could then give to the speaker, and they could help focus their approach to the students. They knew what they were already interested in. And the kids were really engaged when the speaker was there, because they already knew it was like a prep. They knew this person was coming. They were really excited about them coming. And then I also love to use the Right Question process so the students can come up with their own individual questions for research projects and experiments. And experiments has been the one that's really been tough for me to figure out how can I use this process to get them to come up with experimentable, like testable questions. That if you do science at all, you know testable questions are closed. And so I've gone back and forth with this, and I feel like it was pretty successful for the first time ever. I taught the students what testable questions are first. They already knew the Right Question process because we'd already done these other times. And then we did an experiment using a lung capacity test. so they could measure how much their lung capacity was, and a different reaction time one. And the group that was doing lung capacity, I just put up the word lung capacity, but I told them they could only use testable questions. So I gave it a qualifier, but then they still used the right question process, and they came up with some great testable questions, and then they chose one for their experiment. So we have some students doing, does smoking impact lung capacity, and they're designing their own experiment on that question. We have some students doing, do athletes have larger lung capacities? So these are testable questions that now they're able to design their own experiments for. So that was exciting that that went well. So, thanks. Sure. Sure. So our school is for students who are at risk of dropping out, and they're behind by at least a grade. They're 16 or older. So sometimes they're 16 in 8th grade. Sometimes they're 16 and they're at least one grade behind. And so they have a variety of reasons for being behind. It could be pregnancy or moving a lot, coming to this country, all kinds of things. And a lot of them have lower reading abilities, just a variety of issues. Lots of times they have gaps in their education. So they missed the ecology unit when they were supposed to be learning that. So they have all these gaps in their learning. So this process has been a great unifier for that. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ling Sapit, and I'm a humanities teacher at the Urban Science Academy, which is where Yana teaches now. I've been doing the QFT for about the same number of years as Yana has, maybe 2 or 3. And I just want to say that I totally agree with Amy about the empowerment piece, because one pattern I've noticed that keeps coming back again and again is after we do the metacognitive piece where I ask students what they learn and how the process made them feel. Again and again, I have students that say, Ms. Pete, I feel so smart. I feel so smart. And that, as a teacher, moves me, because a lot of my students come to me behind a couple grade levels of reading. They are not confident in their academic abilities. And so for me to hear this makes me feel smart is a sign that the QFT is working, and it just makes it that much more, I think, valuable in terms of the time that we use. So to use the analogy of the bus getting across the bridge, I think that the QFT actually is like the wheels on the bus, because in order to facilitate the thinking process, you have to have a method. And I think that that's what the QFT is for me in my classroom. And by the way, I just wanted to send a shout out to Tyree Villar, who's one of my students. So I'm going to be talking about a QFT process that she actually went through. So thank you for being here. I feel honored that I have a student in the room with me. So I will talk about a QFT process I did in the fall using the word Afghanistan. So we were in the beginning of stages of reading the book The Kite Runner, it takes place in Afghanistan, and I decided I wanted to see what they knew about the country. And so I just put that word up there, we did the QFT, and then about a month later, actually maybe 3 weeks later, after we had learned a little bit more about culture and the religion in Afghanistan, then I had them do the same QFT process using the same word, Afghanistan, and I had students look at the questions they created in the beginning of the unit and the middle of the unit, and I said, what do you notice? And they were able to identify what they had learned through looking at and analyzing the questions. And I just thought that was fascinating, because through the metacognitive process, you can actually see the student learning. And I've only been teaching for 5 years, so for some people that may be a long time, but for me, I feel like I'm still learning every day. So I'm always looking for ways to gauge student learning, and I think that's one of the most challenging things about teaching. So for me to see that I could actually gauge student learning using this process was incredible revelation. So, in addition to using the QFT as an assessment, I've also used it to help students brainstorm questions for research, similar to what Yana has done, and I've also used the QFT just in terms of getting the background knowledge that students have about a topic. So I don't know. I've used it in so many different ways, and I've experimented with a little bit. So trying more than one prompt has worked really well for me. So I I don't want to put my student on the spot, but if you want to talk about your experience at the QFT, I'm sure everyone would love to hear it. But she may be feeling too shy today. It's okay. So, were there any other teachers that wanted to?
We have somebody from City Year who is using it.
Sure. Okay. Sorry. I was going too far.
My name's Annie Zebekolu, and I'm an art teacher at Lexington High School. And I teach an advanced drawing class, which is really based on visual problem solving. The students use observation drawing as a point of departure for solving visual problems, and they do sketching in the same kind of way that you would take notes for writing a paper, let's say, or doing research on something. You have something that you can draw, and you can observe it for 3 or 4 days, investigate how it's put together, what happens when you use it, and so on. And then I give them a problem to solve based on the investigation that they did. So the prompt that I used for my class was, "The horn is a sound machine." And the kids were amazing. They were like, "What is a machine?" And is an instrument a machine? I mean, they just kind of went through. They were drawing horns for 4 or 5 days. Their assignment eventually was that they could distort the horn. They could duplicate parts in the horn. What they needed to do was to create an animated drawing of the horn that looked like the horn itself was trying to make noise. So they had talked about how air moves through the horn, all of that kind of stuff. And the thing that happened after using this process was that the conversation that had been started by them going through this questioning thing, the conversation continued as they were doing their sketches. It continued as they were given the problem to solve, which didn't happen until after they'd been sketching for 3 or 4 days. So it was very interesting for me because there wasn't a right answer to the problem that I posed. And as a result of that, each one of the kids kind of got on their own avenue of questioning as a result of the drawings that they had done in preparation for it, and also as a result of the questions that had been generated by themselves and by their classmates.
Just have to add one personal detail to this. That I have 3 children who have all gone through Lexington High School. One of them, Nathan, is here today. My daughter, Ariella, is in the book, and she's a teacher in Brooklyn today, using this in a high school very similar to the high school where Marcy teaches, with similar student population. And I have a second daughter, Talia, who's 16 years old. And my 2 older children they've gone through the full 20 years of this work and have experienced the pains and the agonies of it. And Tanya kind of arrived in the world, and this thing kind of existed, and then there was this book, and, blah, 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 blah. So, but it was okay. So about a month ago, she comes home, and all of a sudden she has a whole different perspective on her father. And it turns out that her art teacher used the question formulation technique in her classroom. So that was, that made my year. So, thank you. So we have Max Clow from City Year and Karen Russell from Lexington High School. So I'd like to, if you could share quickly.
Hi, everybody. My name is Max Clow. Raise your hand if you've heard of City Year, so I know who's. Almost everybody. Okay, it's a national service organization. We unite young adults ages 17 to 24 for a year of full-time citizen service, and they serve as tutors, mentors, and role models in high-need schools in this very focused effort to address the high school dropout crisis. We've done a small pilot with empowering our core members to use this with their students, and there's an example of that that's in the book. But I'm actually not going to talk about that because we've only done a little bit, and what we've really done is adapt this to make it a central element of our leadership development curriculum. And what we have done, the tweak we have done, is that we give our core members a little bit of a process to come up with their own question focus. And we talk about it as this is problem finding. Our core members are engaged in an incredibly complex service experience. We want to develop their skills at looking into that complexity and picking the problem they want to focus on, and then, of course, finding the right questions to ask about that problem. And we use that as a process to go through before they step into a small group reflection where they will bring that, problem and question to their peers. So it's a space in which the questions and challenges of the core members are at the center of a peer conversation about how to become better leaders. And it has been a game changer. Before this, we said to develop leaders, we need reflection spaces. So we opened up this hour-long reflection space every other week. And we have 2,000 core members in 21 cities. And across the network, people were like, this is a waste of time. People are just venting. They're complaining. It's just a frustration session. When we gave them this process, suddenly people said, these are really powerful, important conversations. People know what they're talking about, and it's really valuable to be able to get this kind of feedback. So I'm a huge fan of the work, and it's been a really transformational element to add to City Year.
I am Karen Russell, and I had the privilege of going to Dan's seminar earlier this year, in December, I think it was. And I teach a memoir class. It's memoir writing and reading for second semester seniors now at Lexington High School. The challenge, as you can imagine, is that they're second semester seniors. And the other challenge and opportunity is that they are the full spectrum of abilities. There's 25 students, and it's a heterogeneous class. So my goal is to bring them together as people who all feel that their abilities and their memories are worth sharing, and to give them encouragement in doing so. So we read and write memoirs. And fortunately, Annie, you're a star today. You're helping my students to create their own books. So she comes in and helps us to create the books themselves, and then they bring pieces of their memoirs to their books. So my job is to help facilitate and inspire them so that they have some writing prompts that they can really enjoy writing and get the best out of what they want to say. So the question technique, as I was thinking about it after the seminar that I went to, the workshop, is that they can generate their own writing prompts as opposed to me assume that I know what they want to write about. So we've been reading a book called All Souls by Patrick MacDonald about Southey. And, of course, the challenge is to think about his experience and how it might inspire their own experiences in Lexington. So we were on the chapter Fight the Power. And it was about the busing in the 70s and the difficulties he had with the cognitive dissonance that he was experiencing in what he was seeing and what he was kind of putting together. So I gave them a variety of prompts. I'm a neophyte at this, so I thought, I hope this is okay. And listen to what they had to say about what his experience was, and then put them in small groups. And they actually wrote questions that they wanted to ask about their own experiences that were prompted by his. And what I really appreciated was a couple of things. First of all, the questions they came up with, I never would have dreamed of asking them, even having read the same book. When they asked the priorities, and then I had them write their own priority questions after hearing what people said. And the top three, one of them was something that I certainly would ask them, which is, do you have a best friend, and what do you consider a best friend? But the others were, the most popular question that they asked, that they wanted to write about was, has there ever been a time you refused to accept reality? And what was that? And for me to ask them that would be so presumptuous, but that was something that really resonated with them and surprised me. So I got to know a lot more about my class. And the other very popular question out of many was, how does maintaining a false appearance change you? And again, something I would never conceive of asking them myself. So I had them finally give me some responses to what this was, and it was a first period class on a Friday. And I wish I had a chart because the energy level went up as the questions began to become more and more fruitful. That doesn't always happen first period Friday. And when I asked them to make a little response to the exercise, people said things like, it was unanimously positive. People said things, the activity required a form of creativity that I was not used to. And the one complaint I got was the, and I don't get this all the time, the bell rang too soon because I really wanted to write about the prompt right then. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you to all the educators who shared. I'm going to close with 2 questions. What are the consequences of graduating citizens from high school who can't ask questions? What doors will remain locked? And how would America change if young people did ask questions? What doors would be opened?
I just want to, it's very interesting, this kind of comes full circle, because when we were writing the book, I spent a good number of days in the hot summer of 2010 in Linksa Pete's 9th grade remedial summer school program at the Urban Science Academy, where students who had gotten an F+ were working through the summer in order to keep from being held back. So I just want to read, and they actually were reading the same book that you were reading with your memoir class. So you can compare the questions, and it's very interesting. So what happens when students learn to ask questions? Linksa Pete, a high school humanities teacher with 3 years of experience in the Boston public school system, shared with us her experience teaching her class that I just described. Whatever their reasons for being there, illness, family crisis, or just plain struggling with lessons and homework, her job was to get them back on track so they could advance with the rest of their class. During the first week of the program, Ms. Pete pushed and cajoled the class through a rigorous process of question asking related to a reading assignment. Those hot July mornings, the students were prodded to think harder than many could ever recall doing. There were definitely some signs of interest and engagement. There was also another, more pained look in evidence, expressed best by a gangly 15-year-old who waved his arms slowly from side to side. Miss Pete! Miss Pete! It took a few calls, but he finally got her attention. Miss Pete, my brain is hurting from asking all these questions. So we really I think just are deeply, deeply grateful for the great work of all of these teachers who have shared today. And there are many, many others. One of the most exciting things to see what happened when the book came out, and an article in the Harvard Education Letter is, thanks to Twitter, you know, Howard asked me if we were doing book tours, and we're not doing book tours. We're basically, thanks to a lot of tutoring from my son Nathan, we're learning how to use Twitter better. And we are actually getting it out there and around, and all of a sudden we found teachers in Leeds and Bradford, England, created this whole group to talk about how they're using it and wrote about it and blogged about it. A librarian at a school in Connecticut who created a book group to talk about how they could use this, and she just wrote to us last night that I can't even begin to describe the changes I see in the classroom. And we hear this from teachers who have been teaching for 33 years, from teachers who are in their first year of teaching. And I just realized there's another teacher here from Cambridge Renton Latin High School who also has used it, and she didn't speak. And so I want to check if Joan Sobel would like to share. It's 5:58, Well, can you just, this is Joan Sobel. Yeah. Okay.
I used to work in a democratic school where we did asking of questions all of the time. And then a couple of years ago, I began to teach AP, and we are an urban school that has every kind of kid in it, and we are also the kind of AP program that does not exclude anybody. So unlike some other places where you need permission to go to AP, at Cambridge Rindge and Latin we're always trying to get kids to take AP. So even though our school is probably 65% non-white, my AP classes have been 95% white. And I also have to say some of the white kids in my class are very working class, and they're very unlike a lot of my very, very academically able kids who have Harvard professor parents and other kinds of things, and who say things to me like, Miss Sobel, have you just read the latest issue of Granta? Which I haven't. So I began to use this technique because of the unevenness of voice in my class, and the fact that I felt that some of my less confident kids who historically weren't always in AP classes, a lot of them were going to be the first kids who ever graduated from college in their families, to give them some voice. And it actually worked. And so not only did the questions get better because of the processes that we went through here, where kids, for example, when we did Proofrock, began to think about which was a question we needed to ask first, which was an umbrella question that contained others. But suddenly there was just a place for every single voice, and those kids began speaking up more when we weren't asking questions.
And I would have felt really bad if I hadn't seen you at the last moment and you hadn't spoken up. Thank you for sharing that.
So I just want to thank Dan and Luz and Amy and all of the other teachers who testified today. It was really phenomenal, and I want to. It did feel like testimonials, but we learn a lot from testifying. And I want to also invite you to join us for a reception. And we also we have wonderful food, and we really invite you to also buy the book, please. We have Harvard Education Press is here until 6:30, and please purchase. Make just one change. Helps the institute, helps spread the word, and join us for a party.